Despite all his rage, he's still just Nicolas Cage. Despite all his rage, he's still just Nicolas Cage. And someone will say his career can never be saved. Despite all his rage, he's still just Nicolas Cage.
Welcome to Just Nicolas Cage, where I very slowly work my way through Nicolas Cage's filmography. And today I'm talking about the 2002 war film Windtalkers. In Windtalkers, Nicolas Cage plays a US Marine during World War II whose entire squad is killed, leaving him with both physical and mental scars. A short time later, he gets tasked with the assignment to protect two Navajo code talkers. And he's given a secondary assignment that if it looks like those two might get captured, his mission is to kill them to ensure that the code doesn't get broken. The title Windtalkers refers to the Navajo code talkers, which is one of the lesser known stories of World War II. During the war, the Japanese were very quick at breaking American codes and intercepting their communications, so the Americans needed a secure, reliable code to relay messages. 2 months after Pearl Harbor, Philip Johnston, who was a white civil engineer that grew up on a Navajo reservation, brought up the idea of using the Navajo language as a code because the Navajo language is very complex, adaptable, and precise. And also it wasn't a written language, and in 1942 less than 40 non-Navajo people in the world understood it. So 29 Navajo Marines were assembled to help create the code. They created 411 terms that could be used in combat. They used pre-existing words to represent military terms, like they used the Navajo word for bird to refer to airplane, ironfish meant submarine, and tortoise meant tank. And they also coded the English alphabet by taking a word that began with A like ant, and they translated that into Navajo and that word represented the letter A. Using this system, it took 20 seconds to encode, transmit, and decode a message, whereas it took a crypto machine 30 minutes. During the course of World War II, about 400 Navajos participated in the Code Talker program. The code led to a dramatic reduction in Marine casualties, because it was a rapid, reliable, and picture-perfect way to ask for air support, or an emergency resupply of ammo without being intercepted. In 1944, during the battle in Saipan, a group of Marines were in enemy territory, and they were getting mistakenly shelled by friendly artillery units who thought that they were the enemy. They radioed in for them to stop, but because the Japanese often sent fake radio messages, the other people didn't believe them, and the bombing continued. Eventually, the people that were doing the shelling radioed back and asked them to prove their identity by asking if the Marines that were under attack had a code talker there, and the code talker rushed to the radio and spoke the code, and finally the friendly fire stopped. During Iwo Jima in 1945, 6 code talkers worked around the clock sending and receiving 800 messages, all without error. The Navajo code was never broken, and even today it's history's only unbroken battlefield code. Marine Division Signal Officer Major Howard Connor said that without the Navajo, the Marines never would have taken Iwo Jima. Despite this, the Navajo soldiers received no recognition until 1968, and no medals until the year 2000. Pretty fascinating stuff, right? Too bad this movie is barely about that. I learned pretty much everything I just said from a History Channel documentary I found on YouTube. I mean, some of that stuff is in the movie. There's a brief scene at the start of Windtalkers showing how the code worked, and even then they only showed one half of the code they used and not the alphabet system that I mentioned. There's a couple other interesting bits I learned from the documentary that are in the movie too, like how a Native American POW that wasn't a code talker was tortured and forced to try to translate the code, and even he couldn't crack the code even though he could speak the Navajo language. And I do also like that the movie showed the Navajo prayer rituals. From what I could tell from that History Channel thing I watched, it seems like this was a big part of how the Navajo coped during the war.
And I asked the holy people to protect me from any harm from the enemy.
There's also a part in the movie that's very similar to what happened in Saipan, where they were being shelled by friendly fire. But in the movie their radio is broken, so Nick Cage and the code talker infiltrate a Japanese camp. But when the Navajo guy uses the radio, instead of having to use the code, he just radios in to call it off using English and there's no problem. I don't know why they changed it like that, because the true story is more interesting. And it would have been the perfect opportunity to showcase how useful the code was in a cinematic way. But my biggest issue with the movie is that it's a 2-hour and 30-minute long movie called Windtalkers. But there's literally only 2 brief scenes in the movie where we see the code in action. And there's long stretches that don't even focus on the Navajo characters. I really think this movie should have spent more time at the start assembling this team of code talkers, and develop these characters and show more about their testing of the code and their training process. The movie just glosses over that stuff. But it is a Hollywood production from the early 2000s. I shouldn't be too surprised that the white man is the star. And in this case, the white man is Nicolas Cage, so, you know, I'm somewhat grateful for that. And I don't really blame the director, because John Woo, who directed it, said that the studio wanted a John Wayne movie. Just a typical American hero film with explosions every few minutes. I already gave an overview of John Woo in my review of Face Off, and I covered a lot of his trademarks. And not all of them are in this movie, obviously, considering the subject matter. Nobody wants to see a US soldier with a pistol in each hand diving through the air in slow motion, with doves flying around. Actually, who am I kidding? That sounds amazing. But the trademark large-scale gunplay and ballet of bullets that John Woo is known for definitely comes through in this movie. The action in Windtalkers is definitely the standout feature. It has that John Woo signature style of showing a guy shooting somebody, and then it cuts to a close-up of the guy dying or getting blown up in slow motion. And that happens a lot here. You also have the impressive stunt work that you expect from a John Woo movie, lots of bodies flying through the air. There's also a lot of fire and a lot of explosions, and I mean a lot of explosions. I think even Michael Bay would be like, alright buddy, enough with the explosions. But I've got to admit, some of them are really badass. You know, when I watch a war movie and the enemy soldier is being killed, I don't often relish in their deaths. Because obviously a lot of the time the enemy soldiers were just young people following orders. But even then there were a few times in this movie where people got blown up and I was like, oh shit, that's so cool. The action is filmed very well for the most part. There's some incredible looking shots. Often with a John Woo movie, it's impressive how many people he crammed into one action scene, usually in a building or something. But he's working on a larger scale here, and you certainly feel the scope and the scale of the battlefield here. The only camera work I didn't really like in the movie was that there's a few parts where the camera is right up close to the action. And sometimes it's effective and visceral and you feel like you're in the thick of it, but then sometimes it's really distracting and annoying. You become aware that there's somebody flailing the camera around like a goddamn found footage movie. But thankfully I only felt that way a couple of times. I also do think that the war scenes went on for a little bit too long and got a bit repetitive. At a certain point it just felt like, okay, explosion, guy gets shot in slow-mo, explosion, slow-mo shot, explosion. I get it. I did watch the extended cut though, so maybe the theatrical version is paced better, I don't know. And also, John Woo's movies are not particularly known for showcasing realism, which is awesome for like a Hong Kong shoot-'em-up or face-off, but maybe not for a World War II movie. Here you have stuff like Nick Cage spraying his gun around without aiming but still perfectly hitting all the enemies. There's parts like this where a bunch of Japanese people just run straight up to Adam Beach instead of, you know, standing back and shooting him. And for some reason, grenades seem extra powerful in this movie. It seems like they blow up like a goddamn atomic bomb sometimes. And I'm sure there's a bunch of other inaccuracies that war aficionados would be able to spot easily. But honestly, none of that stuff really annoys me, but I'm just bringing it up because I know it does bother some people. In terms of the themes, John Woo once said, "My films are concerned with family, friendship, honor, and patriotism." And I think that makes sense. I think especially friendship is something you can find in The Killer and Hard Boiled. And in Windtalkers, with the Americans teaming up with the Navajo Marines, friendship is certainly a theme here too. The friendship between Cage and Adam Beach's character is compelling at times, but I also wish they explored the Navajo and American friendship in a less cliche way. Like they do that old trope where the racist guy gets saved by the guy he was prejudiced against. And then he realizes, maybe these guys aren't so bad after all. But there's other scenes that focused on the unlikely friendship that work better. I like the parts where Christian Slater and a Navajo Marine called White Horse played music together. White Horse uses his traditional Native American flute, and Christian Slater uses a harmonica. And the instruments initially don't really go together because they're so different, but eventually they make it work and make beautiful music together, which just so happens to parallel the relationship between the Americans and the Navajo Marines in the movie. I see your metaphor there, very clever, John Woo. So let's talk about Nicolas Cage in this movie. At this point, Nicolas Cage has played multiple characters with a military background prior to this, but this is his first full-blown ground warfare, battlefield, shoot-'em-up action movie. His character is a bit of a cliche, you know, sole survivor with PTSD. But then again, that is something that a lot of people really did go through in World War II, so I feel a bit guilty reducing that to a cliche. And he's also one of the only characters in the movie with any resemblance of a character arc or character development. Nicolas Cage mostly gives a very somber performance. There's lots of shots of him staring off, looking sad, which is obviously appropriate for the subject matter. But then during combat, he kind of cages out a bit and goes full barbarian mode. Again, it does kind of make sense for a character with PTSD on the battlefield to be unleashing his trauma out against the Japanese, but I would also be lying if I said I didn't get a kick out of some of the wacky faces that Nicolas Cage was pulling. There's a couple of parts where his acting is a bit shaky, like this part where he's drunk.
First one they gave me, I threw it into the ocean.
What'd you get that one for?
For not dying.
And there's other times where he's a notch too over the top. but as a whole it's a fine performance. A lot of the other characters are just walking cliches. Of course you've got the scene where they're talking about what they'll do after the war, and the characters include the guy who keeps talking about his wife. Gee, I wonder if this guy dies. And you've also got the racist asshole guy, and you've also got a young Mark Ruffalo as a Greek guy with a mustache, but we never really learn much about him. We never get to find out if we like him when he's angry. I actually did like Christian Slater quite a bit in this. He does play it very Christian Slater-y, but I still enjoyed him in it. I also like that his name was Ox because it reminded me of my favorite episode of The Simpsons. There's only 2 Navajo characters in the movie. Adam Beach plays Yazi. He's a fairly simple character, but he served the story. We see his growth from naive and excited rookie to a man that's disillusioned and battle-scarred. And Adam Beach plays it very well, and he's very likable. And the other Navajo guy is White Horse. He's the guy I talked about jamming with Christian Slater. And he's very good too, although I wish he had a bit more screen time. But these 2 were my favorite characters in the whole movie. So yeah, overall, there's things to like about Windtalkers. The action in particular is certainly quite the spectacle, even though it does get a bit repetitive. And the movie does occasionally hit some emotional beats that did land for me. But I just can't overlook the fact that they took such an interesting story from history that, as far as I know, I don't think it's been depicted in a film before or after. And they tucked it away into the periphery of a generic story that we've kind of already seen before, full of cliches. The bottom line is this movie should have focused way less on Nicolas Cage, and that's a sentence I never thought I would ever say, so you know I'm serious. So if you want to see a World War II movie with lots of cool explosions, then check out Windtalkers. But if you want to learn about the unsung Navajo heroes, then read a book or watch a documentary because you're not getting much of that here. Next on Nicolas Cage's filmography is the first and only movie he ever directed, and that's the movie Sonny. So until next time guys, thanks for watching.